take into account the fact that you have fiscal deficits, that you have very little fiscal space, you have low economic growth, you have sky-high debt to GDP ratios. In other words, to surmise, you're not living in La La Land with rainbows and pots of gold at the end of the rainbow. You're also going to be held accountable for your decisions. So let's start. And Sia, I'm going to initiate the discussion with you as the first president of Africa who has to make a decision to drive inclusive growth. Where would you start, given what you're enjoying from your experience over the summit?
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, good morning to everyone that is here. I think the key issues that Africa faces are not really around strategy and planning. We've been doing a lot of planning and strategy. We now need a bias for action. The time for planning and not implementing is over. So we therefore require a sense of urgency, but also I think it becomes important that we look at our governments and we run them like successful corporations. What do I mean? What I mean is it's important that we have a set of measurement criteria, that we periodically monitor the implementation thereof, and that we have bold decision-making, and we try and remove all kinds of barriers that hinder us or impede us from implementation. We also have a lot of over-regulation, which is what is also slowing down decision-making. So for me, it becomes critical that we continuously communicate our challenges, but we also confront them head-on. At the level of the countries, one of the key issues that I think we need to deal with is the integration of the 5 economic regions in Africa, so that we can create that continental marketplace that is required in order for us to move forward. But also, as we deal with our current challenges, we must also deal with the challenges of the future. Importantly, we must understand what the workplaces of the future are going to look like, and we must start preparing our youth today in terms of teaching math, science, technology, innovation, and entrepreneurship in order for us to be able to focus on what the 4th industrial revolution means. We must also unlock opportunity, and in order for us to unlock opportunities, I don't think it is useful that all of us must try and run around to try and do the same things in our different countries. But what is important is that we need to focus on key clusters and key competencies per country and decide which countries are going to specialize on what, so that we can create the kinds of economies of scale that are required in order for us to be able to reduce the cost of doing business. That is very, very important for us. The issue also at an industry level is that we need to create an ecosystem that recognizes that an integrated planning and development philosophy is important, and we must have a systemic approach in terms of how do we synchronize investments, how do we make sure that the projects that we have are actually implemented, and we emphasize on collaboration.
Give me your number 1 priority of the list that you have put forward.
In terms of priorities, I think power and infrastructure are critical, because we want to make sure that manufacturing can be deepened, because that is going to be the source of employment creation. Manufacturing is one of those things which will assist us in terms of beneficiation as we move forward.
And again, I'm going to put the stat out there. We've discussed it in a number of forums, is that Africa loses 2% of GDP growth as a result of a lack of physical infrastructure. Power, as Sia has said, being the underpin to that infrastructure story. Don't forget that there's 600 million people in Africa that do not have access to electricity. Thank you, sir. Rich Lesser.
So I have to say this, only an African should be the president of Africa. And so the first responsibility would be to make sure that there's an African leader who is pragmatic, change-oriented, high values, human-centric to lead.
Rich, can I put you out of your misery and make you vice president?
Well, or advisor, but some role that's
I like
not,
that. You're advisor to the president.
So that's fine. That's okay.
I've got
but
it.
not okay. So now, in that context, on Wednesday in the panel that we did together, Winnie and I did together, I talked about sort of what I think the agenda here is around AEIOU: agriculture, education, infrastructure, opportunity, and understanding, richer, deeper understanding of each other and real empathy. And when asked to push further, I talked about education and how important that was. But I would say over the last few days, today, in closing, I would pick a different one. I think there's an opportunity crisis on the continent. An opportunity crisis when you have 29% youth unemployment on the continent, 50% here in South Africa, when there's 3 million formal jobs being created and 10 to 12 million youths entering the market. And if you could only pick one thing to focus on, we have to focus on giving opportunity to young people. There's a very broad agenda beyond that. And the specifics then, in answer to your question, I would focus on encouraging investment, making Africa an easier place to do business. We've seen other countries around the world really put an effort. The WEF comes out with great scorecards on ease of doing business. We have to make it easier here to do that. I'd focus on workforce and skills development, and I'd focus on entrepreneurship. My favorite story of the week was Tony Elamelu, who was also on our panel, and you know, the personal commitment he's made to find 10,000 entrepreneurs in Africa over 10 years, 1,000 a year, finding opportunities. They go on and create other jobs. So if you have to solve one thing first, if you don't find opportunities for young people, it's destabilizing, and it reduces hope, and it reduces the long-term opportunities for people to contribute.
Could I say rapid job-rich economic growth for youth? Again, the stat from the World Bank, there are 20 million new entrants into the labor force on an annual basis, and we need to create 20 million new jobs on an annual basis just to cope with that influx, and that's until 2035. So that's from the World Bank. Rich, you happy with that outcome? Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Much appreciated.
Advisor.
Winnie, let me come to you now. I have watched you over years and years and years and admire the tenacity that you sit with on these platforms, challenging the leaders across the African continent and across the globe, may I say, to drive for that inclusive growth. You now have the executive powers.
I am the president?
You're the president of Africa.
Okay, I'm the president. If I had one imperative, that would be to ensure inclusive growth. For me, it is the imperative of protecting the space, the funding, the freedom, the rights of citizens, of workers, of women, of young people, their right to speak up. You know, we had a moving tribute here of Ahmed Kathrada. And in his words, he said, freedom can never be a gift. It has to be fought for. I couldn't agree with him more. The rights of citizens, their fair share of their wealth, their inclusion, will only come when they assert themselves, when they demand it. It won't come as a gift from the rich people in this room. They won't just hand it. They have to demand it. And therefore, they must have the space to make that demand. And so, for me, I was very happy that the World Economic Forum has placed the closing of civic space on its major global risks list. That's important. I was also happy that yesterday we sat with businesses and civil society and talked about how can business support the rights of citizens. That's the way to go. On the 25th of May, Africa Day, African citizens will be launching a new initiative which is called Africans rising, not Africa rising, Africans, people rising. That is a movement, a solidarity movement, calling on our leaders, telling them their failures, and calling and mobilizing to build peaceful, sustainable societies, a successful Africa. That is going to happen. And I also want to remind you that I talk usually very pessimistically here. I'm always sounding like I'm telling off everybody on what they are not doing. But I'm hopeful and optimistic. It's my continent, I have a right to fight. But I'm optimistic. Why? Because I've seen in the farming countries where I've just been, I saw people telling me that when they arrived, the host communities, people were taking off their clothes and clothing those who are running. I believe in our solidarity as African people. I believe that we are able to pull together and live better lives. So I live on a very optimistic note about our capacity to pull together, to be a collective, our Ubuntu. I thank you.
Africans rising, Ubuntu. Ulrich, difficult job to follow.
Yeah, I would say so. My key learnings of this conference are two. The one is the time to act is really now. We don't have time to waste. And secondly, we need to fundamentally change the pattern of actions. We need to move from a local kind of approach to a togetherness approach, because only jointly will we create the pattern of Africa in the future. And I think the appointment of somebody, probably not me, because I'm not competent to do so, to run all of Africa going forward would be a strong signal. So I see 6 key challenges that need to be addressed. The first challenge is the move from the I or the me to a joint approach across the United Nations of Africa. And this can be done by copying from others. You have experience from Europe where some of them worked, some of them didn't work. You have a highly inclusive country in the world that I admire highly, and I see representatives here, and that's Singapore. The way Singapore has brought together different cultures, different nationalities in achieving a common vision is just remarkable. So I think the first thing is we need to learn the togetherness that everybody articulated as a wish in the last couple of days. We need to operationalize this togetherness and say, how do we go about it? And then, so that's the how piece. And then comes the what piece. And on the what side, I think there's a power challenge. And if we act jointly across the countries and provide certainty in the direction that electrification should take, the money will come very easily. I met many, many investors during this last couple of days, and I know them personally globally around the world. Capital is not the problem to deploy in the electrification system. Certainty and clarity where we're going is the challenge, and I think we could get very successfully large-scale PPPs going to get the electrification challenge addressed if we only provide certainty in that field. The second piece, and that's very similar to that, is then the whole infrastructure in the environment. We need to move these people that are going into cities. We need to provide the right kind of infrastructure and get going on the industrial side. Digitalization in the industry opens new opportunities to set up an industrial pattern in Africa in a collaborative way, in a connected way, at investments that are much lower than they would have been historically without the digital capabilities. And I think we should really use that. So we need an alliance for a connected industry here in Africa that reshores the value added that at the moment leaving the country, going to other places. We need to make sure manufacturing grows faster than the fast-growing demand to catch up with the mismatch that we have had through a significant investment in industrialization. The fourth point is the togetherness needs to be getting into a situation where cross borders, people, money, information flow easily. And there is, at the moment, that's one of the biggest challenges that we need to overcome. So the free movement alliance that we need is definitely a point. And the last, and then my fifth point is, I think on the job side, we need to act really, really now. What I described before will create jobs. We need to make sure we get people going. We need to make it easier for entrepreneurs to get started. I can only congratulate Rich on his point on the entrepreneurialism. That will be the lifeblood long term, medium term, and short term. We also need to complement the entrepreneurialism locally with continued investments of global players like us and others to really get going, and we are ready to go at it. So for me, altogether, a pattern change from I to we, an environment where we address the 5 key challenges on the power, on the infrastructure, industry.
I'm going to do what I
side
did
get
to
going.
Sia. I'm going to say, which of those 5 challenges would you prioritize?
The jobs challenge. I think we need to get the people jobs, and if we get people jobs, all the others are supporting basically that, and then we will have employment, wealth creation, and prosperity.
Frederick.
If I'm the president of Africa, I agree with Rich, I'm African, which is an honor, no more French. What I heard during these days here in Durban is, in spite of all the progress of Africa, a lack of quick action. I agree with President Schwieshofer, the other African president.
He didn't want to accept the position, so you chief of staff. I've got a vice president, I've got a chief of staff, and 3 presidents in the middle.
Okay. A lack of quick action, a lack of somehow hope for all the young people. I heard someone asking what kind of future can I offer my daughter, and I think this is really what I would be obsessed with if I would be in this incredible situation of being African president. I would also keep one takeaway, the lack of predictability of Africa for the rest of the world. Which is also something that would worry me. So what would I do? I don't believe much in large powers, large continents, and so I would minimize my role. I would be the African ambassador, so I will speak with my colleagues, the president of Asia, the president of America, the president of Europe, and seriously all the global companies that I need to attract. So I would be the ambassador of Africa. And internally, certainly I would count on decentralized forces, I would count on inclusive growth, and I strongly believe that the 3 key drivers for Africa are cities, are companies, and are local government, and possibly regional integrated local governments. And based on these 3 forces, I would try to give them as much as power. So if I have a budget, I would give incentives.
You've got a budget. You've got a budget.
So I would give incentives to companies that go beyond their own territories, local African companies, of course, not only entrepreneurs, but also large companies, 400 companies that have more than 1 billion revenue, that should become global African companies. I would encourage cities to imagine the new model of development with the people, with inclusiveness in all the possible manners. And I would certainly give incentives to governments to go from 54 countries to, certainly they would keep their identities, but share more in common in order to create regional marketplaces.
Number 1, Frederick.
Decentralization, empowerment.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Mr. Vice President, I know you have to leave the stage, so leave us just with a closing comment from your perspective. Where can Africa be in 10 years if we do the right things?
So I just want to also close where Winnie was, which is this has been a week where I would say relative to being here a couple years ago in South Africa for the WEF, the mood is clearly a bit more sober and it feels more challenged, and there's more concerns that come up both here but also in the private sessions that I've been in. But I remain optimistic about the potential here in the long term, about the ability to work together to drive change, about the strength of the youth of Africa, which are its future. And I'm also just struck, I was just in India a month ago, and I'd been there 3 or 4 years ago, and the mood was very similar to some of what I hear here. Growth had slowed, people felt like things were stuck, it wasn't moving forward. And I would say in the last couple years, this combination of a real reform agenda on the one hand, reforms around demonetization and GST and an identification system and bankruptcy law, and a real focus on human centricity and how do we, in sanitation, in health, in education, has really spurred a sense of optimism and renewed energy, not just that there can be growth from an economic point of view, but that there can be opportunity for individuals to make their lives better. I think it comes down to leadership and this balance between reform, change orientation on the one hand, and a centricity around people and making a difference in individuals' lives on the other. And I believe Africa has the potential has been on a good path over a longer period of time and has the potential to be on that path again.
Rich, thank you so much, and
Thank
thank you
you.
very
I'm
much
sorry I have
for
to
joining
leave.
us. No problem at all. Thank you so much. Thank you. Sia, let's pick up on the leadership aspect. We've got 4 minutes to close off a session, so a minute among each of you. If I can, a minute to each of you, rather. My mathematics needs a little bit of help. Sia, if we look at responsible and responsive leadership, the theme here at the World Economic Forum, in driving inclusive growth, we do the right things, we see the right leadership. Where can Africa be in 10 years?
Yeah, I think if we can be able to build consensus in terms of the kinds of things that we need to do as government, business, labor, and civil society, we can unlock the vast potential that Africa possesses. And in 10 years, we could, in fact, be mentioned in the same breath as some of the successes that the Asian tigers have, for instance, experienced in the last 15 years. I think key to this, though, is that instead of saying we have an Agenda 2063, we need a series of 5-year plans so that we can try and compress time, that we measure those plans, we make sure that the issues around inequality, unemployment, poverty, the lack of participation of women and youth in the economy are addressed. But as I've said before, critical to this, we just need to make sure that we nurture those industries and those areas where we've got key and core competencies, and we really work on our strengths. We develop hubs across the continent where certain centers of excellence are
Sia,
created.
I'm going to have to interrupt you there, but I'm going to take initiative on your 5-year plan. Winnie, I'm going to come to you. 5 years, we see responsible, responsive leadership. Where can Africa be?
Well, I have this picture of Africa in 10 years that's positive, because it's all about people. We are the youngest continent. We have young people, and our young people are today better educated, more healthy than they've ever been. If we can have our countries run, as Sia said, as successful companies, what do successful companies do? They manage the risks. If our governments can unleash the potential of our young people, reduce the risks that are there for the people themselves to invest, smallholder farmers to invest in their land, foreigners to come and invest in our countries, there is a bright future. There's a powerful Africa ahead for us. There are better days to come.
Frederick.
Yeah, I fully agree with you, Winnie. I think there's been a feeling of pessimism around, maybe because of 2016 growth and the commodity prices that have not been what we hoped they would have been. But I mean, we are in a completely different situation as in the beginning of the century. Remember this cover page of The Economist, the hopeless continent? I mean, it has been the contrary has been proven. There has been growth. Obviously, there are ups and downs. There are a lot of difficulties. No one could expect that it would have been a blue sky scenario with no problem. We have a lot of issues to solve. The African people have a lot of issues to solve. But I'm very optimistic about what Africa could become in 5 years. It can carry on the path that has been excellent and much better than the rest of the continents. Look at the rest of the world. Africa has been overperforming, certainly Europe, part of Asia, not all Asia, but part of Asia, Latin America. So let's do not fall into over-pessimism.
And final comments, Ulrich.
I think looking at other examples around the world, whether you take parts of China, whether you take Singapore, whether you take India, I'm very optimistic that Africa has the opportunity to really truly move to a long-term next level of prosperity and wealth. in 10 years' time, we will have resolved the magic quadrant. The magic quadrant is, on the one hand, bringing together the natural wealth with the local demand by creating local jobs and local value chains and get going, supported by a fantastic infrastructure and electricity network that gets supported through PPPs and a common agenda. And last not least, an incredible, much lower unemployment level and a high level of employment of people, and an unleashing of the creativity, of the energy of all the young people that we have here in Africa that I was so impressed with in the last couple of days.
And on that note, we need to accept that Africa is in a challenging global and local environment as we speak. But the messaging needs to go back to the leaders, as we have discussed repeatedly on this platform. And we've got to repeat this message over and over again to the continent's leaders. Africa is in your hands. Please don't drop the ball. Be responsive, be responsible, and ensure a successful, all-inclusive future. Thank you very much for joining us. Ladies and gentlemen, please be seated.